The Eastern Front, late autumn 1943. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, diesel, and cordite. A steel-gray sky presses down on an endless expanse of Ukrainian mud. It has rained for days, what were once roads are now shallow, viscous rivers of black clay. Here a Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger, its imposing 56-ton silhouette caked in filth, is motionless. Its engine roars, a deep, guttural protest against the mire that holds it. The 700 horsepower Maybach V12 screams, pouring immense power into the tank's final drive. Exhaust fumes plume into the cold air. Inside, the world is a cacophony of noise and vibration. The driver strains against his levers, the gears groan under a stress they were never designed to bear. The crew feels the machine fighting itself, a titan trapped in tar. Then a sound that cuts through the engine's roar, a sharp metallic crack, followed by a sickening grind. The tank lurches and the left track ceases its movement. The engine note shifts from a roar of effort to a hollow, unburdened whine. Power is no longer reaching the track. The roar of the engine is now a useless noise. The mighty 88 MKW 36 gun, a weapon that could destroy any enemy on the continent, is silent, its barrel pointing uselessly. Across the boggy field, it is defeated, not by a Soviet shell but by the sheer, unyielding physics of mud and a catastrophic transmission failure. The marvel of engineering has been brought to a permanent halt by the oldest of enemies, the land itself. This single, immobilized tank was the embodiment of a much larger, more profound failure. To understand how this mechanical marvel met such an ignoble fate, we must first journey back to the shock that forced it into existence. The war in the summer of 1941 was not supposed to be a contest of armor. In the eyes of the German High Command, the Blitzkrieg model was perfected. It had shattered Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. The Panzer III and IV, operating in concert with dive bombers and mobile infantry, had proven devastatingly effective. They were fast, reliable, and most importantly, they were part of a seamless, combined arms system designed for rapid encirclement and psychological collapse. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22, 1941, with the same confident tempo. Panzer divisions sliced through Soviet frontier forces, driving deep into the hinterland. They expected to encounter obsolete machines, poorly led and easily defeated. Then in late June, near the Lithuanian town of Razumiai, the 6th Panzer Division ran into something new. A solitary Soviet tank, a KV-1, blocked their advance for a full day. German 37 anti-tank guns, the standard Panzerabwehr cannon, fired shell after shell. They bounced harmlessly off its thick, sloped armor. The same happened with the short-barreled 75 guns of the Panzer IVs. The KV-1 was immovable, impervious steel fortress that systematically destroyed the German column until it was finally silenced by a point-blank shot to the rear or overwhelmed by infantry. Simultaneously, reports flooded in of another Soviet tank, more agile and equally troubling, the T-34. Its design was a revelation. Sloped armor which increased effective thickness and promoted shell deflection. A powerful, long-barreled 76.2 gun, wide tracks that gave it unparalleled mobility in the very mud and snow that bogged down German vehicles. For the German tank crews, it was a moment of profound and terrifying realization. Their own tanks were suddenly obsolete. A German report from the 1st Panzer Division in July 1941 stated bluntly, "The superiority of the Russian T-tank is astounding." Psychological impact was seismic. The Wehrmacht, which had prided itself on qualitative and tactical superiority, found itself outclassed on a fundamental technological level. The shockwave from this encounter raced all the way back to the German Army High Command, the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, and to the desk of Adolf Hitler himself. The demand was immediate and absolute. Germany needed a direct response. It needed a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon, capable of not only matching but decisively overpowering the Soviet armor. It had to be a tank so formidable, so protected, and so heavily armed that it could dominate the battlefield and restore the German armies technological invincibility. This desperate need for a qualitative counterpunch would become the crucible in which the Tiger tank was forged. The shock of the T-34 and KV-1 provided the catalyst, but the Tiger was not born from a blank slate. Its design was the culmination of years of German engineering thought, now accelerated and twisted by the urgent demands of total war. The response to the Eastern Front crisis was not a new idea, but the radical acceleration of an existing one. Since 1937, the Henschel and Porsche firms had been quietly studying designs for a heavy breakthrough tank, a Durchbruchwagen, the Encounters. With the KV-1 and T-34, transformed these theoretical studies into a top priority crash program. A direct specification was issued by the Army Weapons Office, a tank weighing around 45 tons, armed with a high-velocity gun capable of piercing any known armor, and protected by frontal armor at least 100 m thick. This was a monumental leap from the 20-25-ton Panzer IV. Two competing prototypes were rushed to completion. Ferdinand Porsche, Hitler's favorite, presented a complex design featuring a gasoline-electric drive system. Technological marvel, but temperamental and resource-intensive, Henschel and Son, under the pragmatic engineer Erwin Aders, pursued a more conventional, though still immensely ambitious, path, a torsion bar suspension system and a standard hydraulic controlled transmission. The final showdown occurred on April 20, 1942, at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia, on the Führer's birthday, in a dramatic live fire and mobility demonstration. The Henschel prototype proved its superior reliability and practicality. It was selected for immediate production. The Porsche design, while innovative, was deemed too risky for mass production in wartime. Its chassis would later be converted into the massive and deeply flawed Ferdinand tank destroyer. The tank that rolled off the Henschel production line was the Panzerkampfwagen VIA Tiger Osv. It was a monster of engineering. Its primary armament was the now legendary 8.8 cm KW K36L56, adapted from the superb 88 mm Flaw K anti-aircraft gun. This weapon could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, often before the enemy could even hope to return effective fire. A British report would later state that facing a Tiger was like a terrier attacking a mastiff. Its armor was immense. The vertical front plate was a formidable 100 m thick, while the turret front was a staggering 120. For most of 1942 and 1943, this made it virtually impervious to frontal attack from standard Allied anti-tank guns and tank cannons. Its boxy, slab-sided appearance projected an image of brute force invincibility. But this immense protection and firepower came at a dire cost. Weight: the Tiger tipped the scales at 57 tons, far exceeding the original specification. This single, unavoidable fact would become the central paradox of the entire design. Every component, from the engine to the tracks to the final drive, had to bear stresses for which it was barely adequate. The Tiger was a masterpiece of offensive and defensive power, but it was built upon a fragile mechanical foundation, a foundation that would crack under the relentless pressures of war. The Tiger was now a reality, a colossus unleashed upon the battlefields of Europe, but to truly understand its impact and its failure, we must view it not as a single entity, but through multiple intersecting lenses. For a German Panzer crewman in 1943, assignment to a Tiger was a double-edged sword. It was a mark of elite status. They were given the best equipment, the most powerful weapon on the battlefield, and a sense of near invulnerability. But inside the steel behemoth, life was a mixture of immense power and profound vulnerability. The interior was functional but cramped and intense. 5 men occupied a space dominated by the massive gun breech. The loader to the left of the gun fought a constant battle with heavy 2-piece ammunition, the 8 cm shell and its separate powder charge. He had to be strong, agile, and unerringly precise in the claustrophobic moving space. The gunner, seated forward and below him, peered through the superb TZF-9B binocular sight, his hands on the traversing wheels. His was a job of sublime patience and skill, calculating range and lead, knowing that his first shot would almost certainly be the kill shot. The commander stood in his cupola, his head exposed when unbuttoned, scanning 360 degrees for threats and targets. He was the brain of the beast, balancing aggression with survival. Behind him, the radio operator manned the MG-34 machine gun in the hull, his world a narrow slit of vision, and at the front, the driver held the fate of the entire crew in his hands more than any other. He controlled the massive steering levers, the clutch and the gearshift for the complex Alvar transmission. The psychological toll was immense. The initial confidence, born of the Tiger's superiority, could quickly curdle into a specific kind of anxiety. They were a high-value target, always singled out. Every mechanical groan from the drivetrain, every unfamiliar vibration was a potential death sentence. A breakdown did not just mean a failed mission in the vast open spaces of the East or the close confines of Normandy's bocage. It often meant abandonment and the deliberate destruction of their own tank to prevent its capture. The crew lived with the constant knowledge that their greatest enemy might not be a Soviet T or a British Sherman Firefly, but their own machine's fragile heart. From the other side of the gun sight, the Tiger was not a machine with mechanical flaws. It was a myth, a psychological phantom that bred a condition the Germans called Tigerfurcht, tiger fear. On the Eastern Front, the appearance of even a single Tiger could halt a Soviet advance. Infantry and tank crews knew their standard weapons were useless. The 76-point Tomb gun of the T-34 could only penetrate a Tiger's side or rear armor at perilously close range. To get that close meant advancing under the Tiger's gun, which could destroy them from over a mile away. Soviet tactics had to adapt brutally. They would use numerical superiority, often sacrificing several T-34s in a frontal assault to distract the Tiger, while others maneuvered at great risk to get a flanking shot, or they would rely on massed artillery, anti-tank rifles, and heroic infantry assaults with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails. For the British and Americans in North Africa and later in Western Europe, the first encounters were equally traumatic. A report from the North African campaign described the 75 shells of American Grant and Sherman tanks bouncing off the Tiger like ping-pong balls. The standard response was not to engage in a fair fight, it was to call in artillery barrages, airstrikes, or to swarm the Tiger with multiple tanks, hoping to track it or disable its gun. The British developed specialized tanks like the Sherman Firefly, armed with a powerful 17-pounder gun, which could defeat a Tiger frontally, but it was one of the few that could. This psychological impact was a tangible, strategic asset for the Germans. A single operational Tiger could dominate a sector, forcing the Allies to commit disproportionate resources to counter it. It bred caution, hesitation, and a deep-seated respect that often bordered on terror. The very silhouette of the Tiger, low and wide with its long, overhanging gun barrel, became an icon of German martial power, a symbol that for a time was more powerful than the machine's own crippling limitations. These two angles reveal the Tiger as both a sanctuary and a trap for its crew, and a terrifying specter for its enemies. But to understand its ultimate failure, we must now look past the psychology and into the cold, hard reality of its engineering. The Tiger was a masterpiece of German engineering philosophy: solve a problem with overwhelming, uncompromising technical excellence. But this philosophy, when applied to the brutal, resource-constrained reality of mass production and frontline service, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Every component was overbuilt to handle the tank's staggering 57-ton weight. The torsion bar suspension system, with its interleaved road wheels, provided an exceptionally stable firing platform and distributed the weight effectively, but it was a maintenance nightmare. Replacing an inner road wheel required the removal of up to 9 outer wheels first. In the mud of the Russian Rasputitsa or the freezing cold of winter, this was a task that could take a crew hours, leaving them utterly exposed. The heart of the mechanical failure, however, lay in the tank's powertrain. The 700 horsepower Maybach HL 230P 45 V12 engine was powerful, but it was straining at its limits. It had to propel a small house made of steel. The power was routed through an Alvar semi-automatic transmission, a complex preselector gearbox that was advanced for its time, but the final drive units, the geared assemblies that transferred power from the transmission to the tracks, were the system's critical and catastrophic weakness. These final drives were simply not robust enough for the constant stress. They were undersized, operating at the very edge of their material tolerance. A sharp turn, especially in heavy mud or on uneven ground, placed an immense, instantaneous torque. Load on them, the standard failure was a shear pin snapping or the gear teeth themselves stripping. The official German manual warned drivers to avoid sharp turns at high speed and to use a complex, fuel-wasting pivot steering technique whenever possible to reduce strain, but in the heat of combat, such cautions were often forgotten or impossible to follow. A sudden maneuver to face a threat, a desperate attempt to extricate itself from mud, these common battlefield actions could, and frequently did, result in the loud final crack that meant immobility, the Tiger's greatest tactical strength. Its ability to dominate from a static position was, in part, a mechanical necessity. If the engineer saw a flawed masterpiece, the logistics officer saw a nightmare. The Tiger was not just a tank, it was a massive consumer of scarce resources and a parasite on the German army's already strained mobility. Its sheer weight was a constant operational hindrance. Most bridges in Europe and Russia could not support it. This necessitated the use of complex and time-consuming bridging equipment or forcing the tank to ford rivers, a risky maneuver that required extensive preparation and ideal conditions. When a Tiger broke down, which was often, recovering it was a Herculean task. Standard recovery vehicles were useless. It required another Tiger, or more often, two massive 18-ton FAMO half-track prime movers working in tandem for hours to drag the crippled behemoth to safety. Each broken-down Tiger could therefore immobilize an entire maintenance section for a day or more. Its fuel consumption was prodigious. The Tiger guzzled over 5 gallons of gasoline per mile on roads and significantly more in cross-country conditions. A single company of 14 Tigers could consume over 700 gallons of fuel just to move 10 miles. For the German army, which was chronically short of fuel, especially during the great offensives of 1944, this was an unsustainable drain. Tigers were often abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they had simply run out of fuel and could not be refueled. Furthermore, the Tiger was not a strategic weapon, it was a tactical one. It could not be easily transported by rail without a complex process of removing its wide combat tracks and fitting narrower transport tracks to fit within European rail gauges. This process, which had to be performed at the front and rear lines, took a skilled crew precious hours, making rapid strategic redeployment impossible. The Tiger was a lion in a cage of its own making, powerful within a small radius, but utterly dependent on a fragile and overstretched logistical chain that was constantly under attack. The Tiger's story is thus one of a weapon that excelled in the moment of combat, but was defeated by the broader, grinding realities of warfare. This tension between tactical brilliance and strategic failure would build towards an inevitable, violent climax. The summer of 1943, the codename is Citadel, the German High Command commits to a massive offensive to pinch off the Soviet salient at Kursk. It is to be the greatest clash of armor in history and the stage for the Tiger's most devastating performance. Among the units spearheading the attack is the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion. On the morning of July 5th, these Tigers roll forward across the vast steppe. They advance in a wedge formation, their wide tracks churning the dry earth. They are the spearhead, designed to punch through the deepest Soviet defensive belts. They immediately encounter a nightmare landscape. The Soviets, forewarned of the attack, have constructed a defensive network of staggering depth and complexity. Vast minefields, interlocking anti-tank gun positions, and dug-in T-34s await them. But for the Tigers, this is their ideal environment. They halt at the crest of a ridge just over 2,000 meters from the Soviet lines. To the Soviet tank crews peering through their scopes, the Tigers are distant, low-silhouetted shapes. Then the first flashes of fire. The 88 shells cross the distance in a fraction of a second. A T-34 is hit. Its turret is ripped from its hull in a violent explosion of overmatched steel. Another follows. Then Another, the Soviet 76.2 return fire is ineffective at this range. Shells spark and ricochet harmlessly off the Tiger's thick frontal armor. The Tigers are methodical, precise. They engage targets with near impunity, turning the Soviet defensive positions into a graveyard of burning wrecks. On that single day, the tactical potential of the Tiger is realized in its most pure and terrifying form in the hands of a veteran commander like Kurt Nispel or Otto Carius. The tank was a sniper's rifle, a scalpel. A single Tiger, well-positioned and supplied with ammunition, could hold off a battalion. At Kursk and in the defensive battles that followed throughout 1943 and into early 1944, the Tiger achieved a legendary kill ratio. Statistics from Schwer Panzerabteilung 503, for instance, report the destruction of over 500 enemy tanks for the loss of only a handful of their own in direct combat. It was the apex predator of the armored world. This period represented the Tiger's tactical zenith. It was the embodiment of the German philosophy of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, where a small force of superior weapons led by skilled and aggressive commanders could achieve disproportionate results. The myth of the invincible Tiger was not born from propaganda alone. It was forged in the fire of these brutal, long-range killing engagements. Yet even at the moment of its greatest triumph, the elements of its downfall already present, the very nature of the war was changing, shifting from the set piece battles where the Tiger excelled to a war of relentless maneuver and attrition, a war for which it was profoundly unsuited. The triumph at Kursk was a Pyrrhic victory, the German offensive ground to a halt against the seemingly bottomless reserves of the Red Army. By August 1943, the initiative had permanently passed to the Soviets. The war on the Eastern Front was no longer about decisive armored thrusts, but about a brutal, grinding war of movement and retreat. This new phase was the Tiger's undoing. The vastness of Russia itself became the Tiger's most formidable opponent. The great retreats across Ukraine and later Poland covered hundreds of miles. For the Tigers, every mile was a mechanical ordeal. The complex interleaved road wheels, so effective for stability, became packed with frozen mud in the autumn Rasputitsa and the bitter winter that followed. This mud would freeze solid overnight, literally locking the suspension system. Crews had to spend hours with pickaxes and blowtorches each morning just to get their tanks to move. The relentless marching orders: move 20 kilometers east, hold the line for 3 hours, then retreat another 15, were a death sentence for the overstressed drivetrain. There was no time for the meticulous maintenance the Tiger demanded. The official maintenance schedule was a fantasy in the face of a fighting retreat. Final drives, pushed beyond their limits during frantic maneuvers to escape encirclement, failed. Droves, the sound of a final drive snapping became as familiar and as dreaded as the sound of enemy artillery. Then came Normandy, June 1944. The Bocage country of northwestern France presented a different but equally lethal kind of terrain. The fighting was close-range, brutal, and confined. Here the Tiger's long-range superiority was neutralized in the sunken lanes. In dense hedgerows, a Sherman Firefly or a well-concealed anti-tank gun could be waiting just 100 yards away. The Tiger had to constantly turn, pivot, and reverse in tight spaces, placing catastrophic stress on its transmission. Its immense weight made it difficult to navigate the narrow, soft-ground lanes, and it was a colossal, unmissable target for Allied fighter-bombers. The Jabos, the German nickname for the Allied fighter-bombers, now ruled the skies. A stationary Tiger, broken down or refueling, was a sitting duck for a Hawker Typhoon. Firing 60-pound RP-3 rockets or a P-47 Thunderbolt dropping 500-pound bombs. The phrase fifth column of the Allied forces was grimly coined by German crews to describe their own logistics and recovery services. A breakdown often meant destruction. The Tiger, designed to dominate a wide-open battlefield, was now trapped, outmaneuvered and systematically dismantled, not by superior enemy tanks, but by the combined crushing tyranny of distance, terrain, and mechanical fallibility. The climax had passed. The turning point was not a single battle, but the inexorable shift in the nature of the war itself. The marvel of engineering had been defeated by the war. It was built to win. Now, the final accounting would begin. The raw, unadorned numbers of the Tiger program tell a story of profound strategic miscalculation. From its introduction in 1942 until the end of the war, German industry produced just 1,347 Tiger I tanks. In that same period, the United States built over 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks. The Soviet Union produced over 84,000 T-34s of all variants. This disparity is not merely a footnote, it is the central, crushing reality. The Tiger was a luxury item in a war of attrition that Germany could not afford to fight. Each Tiger consumed resources, man-hours, and factory space that could have produced multiple Panzer IVs or the more balanced, effective Panther tank. The cost of one Tiger at over 250,000 Reichsmarks was astronomical, roughly equivalent to 4 Panzer IVs. German industry was building a handful of exquisite, hand-fitted dueling pistols while its enemies were flooding the battlefield with reliable, mass-produced rifles. The kill ratios touted in German after-action reports, sometimes as high as 10:1 or more, while impressive, are a deceptive metric of success. They measure tactical performance in isolation, ignoring the strategic context. A Tiger company might destroy a dozen Soviet tanks in a delaying action, but it would inevitably be forced to retreat, often abandoning its own broken-down vehicles. The losses were irreplaceable. The Soviets and Americans could absorb their losses and replace them within weeks. Germany could not. By late 1944, the situation was catastrophic. The Schwer Panzerabteilungen, the independent heavy tank battlements, were shadows of their former selves. They operated in kennel strength, with 2 or 3 operational Tigers supported by graveyard of broken-down hulks waiting for spare parts that never came. A report from the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion in September 1944 is stark. Combat strength, 8 Tigers, operational, 3. The rest were immobilized by mechanical failures awaiting repair. For every Tiger destroyed in combat, several more were lost to breakdown, abandonment, or lack of fuel. The Tiger did not just die in battle, it withered and died from a terminal case of strategic anemia. The physical destruction of the Tiger force was matched only by the complex and enduring legacy it left in its wake, a legacy that would be shaped as much by myth as by realities. In the smoldering ruins of the Third Reich, the Tiger was reborn not as a weapon, but as a legend. This legend was carefully cultivated from 2 sources: the genuine Ostrach reports of its Allied adversaries and the post-war memoirs of the German veterans who had crewed them. Men like Otto Carius in his book Tigers in the Mud and Kurt Nispel, the war's highest scoring tank ace, painted a picture of a magnificent weapon, let down not by its design, but by the circumstances of the war and the failings of the high command. Their stories of incredible long-range kills and against all odds defensive actions were gripping and, for the most part, factually accurate on a tactical level. They cemented the image of the Tiger as the ultimate tank. Allied intelligence, meanwhile, contributed to the myth through its own initial shock. The detailed reports on captured Tigers, describing their formidable armor and gun, were circulated widely. The Tiger terror that had gripped the front lines did not dissipate. With victory, it was codified into military history. The tank's fearsome reputation became an indisputable fact, overshadowing its catastrophic reliability issues. This created a historical dichotomy that persists to this day. On one hand, the legend of the invincible Tiger, the king of the battlefield. On the other, the reality of a mechanically flawed, strategically disastrous behemoth. The truth, as always, lies in the synthesis. Tiger was a marvel of focused engineering, possessing arguably the best balance of firepower and protection of any tank in the war for its time, but it was also a profound strategic error, a machine whose complexity and cost were utterly mismatched to the war its nation was fighting. Its most enduring impact was perhaps on tank design itself. The post-war world, led by the Soviet Union and the United States, absorbed the lessons of the Tiger, but not in the way Germany had intended. They did not pursue ever heavier, more complex designs as the primary arm of their armies. Instead, they sought to replicate the concept of the Tiger, a powerful gun and heavy armor, but integrated into more balanced, reliable, and maintainable platforms like the Soviet T-54 or the American M48 Patton, the era of the dedicated, unsustainable super tank had ended with the Tiger. It was a dead end in the evolution of armored warfare. The story of the Tiger is complete, from its traumatic birth through its fearsome prime, and its ignoble decline to its complicated legacy. All that remains is to step back from the statistics and the wreckage, and to consider what this machine truly represents in the broader scope of history. The Tiger tank rests today in museums and monuments around the world. Its paint is chipped, its steel is cold. Children gaze up at its massive, silent form, trying to imagine the roar and the fury. It is an artifact now, a piece of history frozen in time. But its story is a timeless parable of technological ambition. It stands as a stark reminder that the value of a weapon is not measured solely by its performance in a single, idealized moment of combat. It is measured by its reliability in the mud and the snow, by the strain it places on the industry that builds it and the logistics that sustain it, and by its ability to endure the relentless, grinding passage of a long campaign. The Tiger was a masterpiece of solving the wrong problem with brilliant, yet ultimately self-defeating intensity. It was designed to win duels, but war is not a duel, it is a brutal, chaotic and elemental force that tests not just the quality of a nation's steel, but the strength of its economy, the resilience of its supply lines, and the wisdom of its strategy. In the end, the Tiger's failure was not merely a mechanical one, it was a philosophical failure. It represented a belief that a war could be won through a few transcendent instruments of violence rather than through the balanced, sustainable, and overwhelming application of military power. The mud that choked its tracks and the transmission that failed under strain were not just random misfortunes, they were the physical manifestations of this fundamental and fatal miscalculation. The Tiger, therefore, is more than just a tank. It is a lesson in the limits of technology, the tyranny of complexity, and the unforgiving nature of war itself. It is the story of a marvel that was built to conquer a continent, but was ultimately defeated by the very earth it was meant to dominate.